Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. My name is Kristen Ronay. I'm the Associate Executive Director of the OHSAA, and we are so happy that you found the time out of your busy schedules to join us today for our last of 3 new administrator workshops, obviously the virtual one in which you're participating now. It's always a busy time of year, obviously the Monday after the first Friday night of football. For our brand new administrators on here, figuring out lots of processes that you all are having to learn going through it for your first time. So we wish you the best of luck, and we hope that you find the information presented to you today to be useful in your moving forward with OHSAA regulations and bylaws and whatnot. So a few little logistical things before we dive in. We are being joined registration-wise by 127 of our closest friends here, so we really appreciate the interest in this online workshop. The agenda that we're going to go through today, just so everybody has a feel, Laura Vermilia, our CFO, is going to go over some financial things and information you need to know if you end up hosting any of our postseason tournament events. We have Emily Mason joining us, who is going to be going over some sport administration regulations, what you can do in season and out of season. I will spend some time going over student eligibility regulations and bylaws. And then last but not least, we'll have Alexis Holderman joining us, who is going to be going over some Final Forms MIOSHA technology issues that you need to be aware of. So that's what the day looks like. We are hoping to have you out of here by around 12 o'clock or 12:30, depending on maybe the number of questions that come in. But we are recording this workshop. So if you have to step away for any reason, we will have it posted online and can email you all the link. That way you can view it either Wednesday or Thursday when we get that uploaded and posted online. So that's some of the logistical stuff. Questions and answers. If you have a question as we're going throughout, you should have on your screen a Q&A feature. You can go ahead, because this is a live event, type in your question. We have Ronald Sayers, who is our Senior Manager of Eligibility and Technology. He is kind of behind the scenes on this day. He can either answer your question directly, or if it would be for the betterment of the group, he will go ahead and ask the question out loud. That way we can get some follow-up and engagement in that capacity. So again, use your question and answer feature that you see on your screen there to ask any questions that you may have. So at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Laura Vermilia. Again, she is our Chief Financial Officer, to introduce herself and give you some information about financial information. Laura?
Thanks, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual session. I won't take up too much of your time. Just wanted to highlight a few things, finance and accounting wise, that you need to be aware of. The first is membership dues. Membership dues, as voted on by our board, is currently $50 per sport offered. We will send those dues invoices late September, early October. So you may want to get your PO ready with your treasurer. Again, it's the sports offered that you fill out. I believe it's in MIOSHA. It might now be in Final Forms, but it's $50 per sport. So we'll be sending out those dues invoices. The other is the Athletic Enrichment Fund. This is a fund that our board created about 2 years ago, where at the end of the year, they determine if there will be a payout from the Athletic Enrichment Fund, and that goes to every member high school. Recently we sent out for this past school year $2,000 check to every athletic department at a member high school, and that is to use for equipment, officials, promoting positive fan behavior, those kinds of things. So again, that check was mailed to your school at the end of July. The year previous, it was $1,250. So the amount can change up or down based on our financial results and what the board approves. And in order to be eligible for that, you have to have paid your member dues on time and also return your Reformation card, which Alexis will explain a little bit more about later on. Hosting. If you host the OHSAA tournament event, you will be paid a hosting fee. In addition, you will need to have gate ticket sales for cash. So you do a start bank and you input that information of how many tickets you sold into the hometown ticketing app. You will receive a very detailed information and instructions on how to utilize hometown ticketing if you don't already have it at your school, what the codes are for our box office, because you will need to use the hometown box office for the OHSAA to scan tickets and to sell tickets. That will come from Claudia Markoff, who is our customer experience manager and is all things tickets. And then also to get paid the hosting fee, you'll need to fill out a financial report. Those are maintained in Google, and they can always be the link to the report and then instructions to filling out a financial report can be found at ohsaa.org/financials. If you host a sectional or district tournament event, your district athletic board treasurer will be your source of information there, and they have their own link to Google. I know that's a lot of information. You can always reach out to me, Laura Vermilia. I think the information will be distributed to you of staff and who does what, but I can help with anything financial. And then lastly, at the end of each season, I host a financial recap for all member schools. Anyone at your school can attend. The date of that will be published in the administrator update that goes out every 2 weeks. And again, that's just an online season recap of how we did financially at the OHSAA at the end of each season. For each sport, and then also for each athletic district. And that's pretty much how you interact with our office when it comes to finances.
Perfect. Laura, thank you very much for your time this
You're
morning.
welcome.
And everyone, Laura is excellent to work with. She's very timely in getting back with everybody. So like she said, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to her. So at this point in time, I'm going to throw it over to Emily Mason. Emily is our senior sport administrator, and I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more. But just for everybody's knowledge, who to reach out to at the OHSAA. On our website, there is a who to contact, which outlines which sports, but my office, and I'll introduce us all a little bit later, compliance is this student eligible? How old are they allowed to be? How many semesters do they get? So those are the type of questions that come to our office. Emily and her team have how many contests are we allowed to play? What is the in-season and out-of-season regulation? So think the sport-specific questions go to the sport-specific administrator, and then whether or not the student is eligible would come to myself and our team, which I'll introduce later. So without further ado, Emily, take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kristen. So as Kristen mentioned, my name is Emily Mason. So I work with the sports of field hockey, volleyball, baseball, boys volleyball, and bowling. So we have a team of 4 of us right now. So as Kristen mentioned, we are on the who to contact page, and that's who you can reach out to if you have any questions for that specific sport. So I'll start with some resources that should be really helpful to not only you, but this is a great place to point student athletes and parents to as well. So every sport has its own web page. So this is just a screenshot of the baseball sport web page. So if you take a look at our website, the sports and tournaments tab is at the top. Once you click on that, it will show every sport listed. So we try to use these web pages to house everything sport related. So you'll see, just as an example, in baseball, all the dates are listed for the upcoming season. The baseball webpage is where you would find the coaches' manuals. So I definitely advise you and your parents and coaches to review these coaches manuals. I refer to these kind of as a one-stop shop, just because it goes into a little more detail than the sports regulations do. And it can provide any type of just kind of more explained summaries of our rules related to that sport, frequently asked questions, any changes for the upcoming season to the NFHS playing rules in that sport, any points of emphasis, that kind of thing. So again, especially for your sports, the coaches manuals are a great place to start. Also on this web page for each sport, we will post the sport administrators, kind of dependent on the sport. We'll send out coaches memos throughout the year. So some are weekly, some are bi-weekly, some are just as topics may arise, but we do send those out to all of the head coaches in those sport. They come directly from the sport administrator, and then we house that information on that sport specific web page. And then also on the webpage, once we get to tournament time, which we're not near yet, but it'll be here probably sooner than we know, these are the sport web pages that you go to for anything tournament related. So again, we'll just stick with baseball. If you want to look up the statewide tournament brackets, you would go to the tournament information page. Once you are heading into the postseason, every school does have to fill out quite a few forms like pass list, bench list, that kind of thing. Those are all housed on the tournament information page. And again, they can be accessed first from the sport specific web page. And then last, our OHSA handbook, we are sending out physical copies. However, I do highly recommend that you bookmark this page on your bookmark tab. As you will scroll through, it is a very large document. And so it's very easy to just use that Control F function once you're using it electronically, just to find what you need. So our handbook for the sport management department is divided into general sport regulations, which, as you can guess, they are sport regulations that really cover all individual and team sports. And then we have sport specific regulations, which go into the more kind of nitty gritty details of each sport. So the start date and end date, tournament dates, that kind of thing are housed there. The season limitations are housed in there for both the team and individual participants. The tournament draw date, any future start dates, tournament dates, that kind of thing. So those are great resources as well. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the coaches manuals can kind of explain those rules a little bit more. Before I get into, as Kristen mentioned, what our office deals with the most, and I'm sure you as school administrators will get a lot of your questions on, are what can student athletes do inside and outside of the season. So before I get into those regulations that our department deals with the most, I did want to briefly mention, because it will apply to what I'm speaking to, is bylaw 414 is the definition of a member of a school team. So just keep in mind that the OHSAA does not deem a student athlete an official member of the school team until they participate in a game, preview, or scrimmage for the team. So a lot of people will kind of think that as soon as they try out and they make the team, they can no longer participate in any non-interscholastic competition. But again, by the OHSAA regulations and bylaws, we don't consider a student athlete an official member of the school team until they participate in a game, preview, or scrimmage for the school team. So the sport regulation we deal with most is General Sport Regulation 7. So basically, it is a pretty big regulation if you go and look at it at some time, and it kind of defines what players and coaches can and cannot do during the season, and then we'll go into outside of the season as well. So a kind of just a quick summary is during the season in individual sports and team sports, student athletes in the same sport are not participated to participate with any or not permitted to participate with any non-interscholastic team, program, or event during the school season. So this is really anything non-school related. It can be as simple as a church rec league. It can be as organized as club volleyball or AAU basketball. Even falling in there are college ID camps, or, I work with the sport of baseball. There's an organization called PBR that puts on really big baseball showcase events. So it's really anything that is non-school related is not permitted during the school season. A quick note on that, I did mention it is for the same sport. So we'll just start with volleyball because I'm in that season right now as one of the sports I administrate. So during the school volleyball season, a student athlete cannot participate with any type of club volleyball showcase event in the sport of volleyball. Now, if they want to participate in non-interscholastic basketball during the school volleyball season, that is permitted because it is not the same sport. And just a quick note, the harshest penalty for violating this regulation is an athlete can become immediately ineligible. Typically, kind of dependent on the case, it'll be as light as a penalty of suspension from the next two contests in that sport. We don't want the athlete to completely become ineligible, but it is a pretty serious violation. And on that note, you're probably thinking, how am I going to control what my athletes are doing on the weekends, after school, that kind of thing? And that's why it's just so important, especially at your preseason parent meetings, to remind your parents of this rule, continually remind your student athletes of this rule, and then that way there are no violations of this. So the next piece of general sport regulation speaks to what players can do outside of the season. So please note that this only applies to team sports. So once you get outside of the school season, there are limitations on how many players from the same school team can participate together on the same non-school or non-interscholastic team. So if you look on the screen, this is printed in the OHSAA handbook, but you'll see that each sport has a different maximum number of athletes permitted to participate together. So again, we'll stick with volleyball. So in the sport of volleyball, anytime outside of the season, there can only be 3 players from the same school team on the same non-interscholastic volleyball team. So there are some exceptions. So one exception is from May 15th through July 31st. This limitation is not in place. So during this time, there can be an unlimited number of athletes participating together from the same school. Additionally, a few more exceptions. If they did not play for the school team, so this always applies from the most recent season. So if they did not participate on the school team in the most recent season, they would not count towards that maximum player limitation. So one example I'll give, I would say we probably see this most, or at least for the sports I administrate, is in the sport of baseball. So, if they're an incoming freshman is kind of where we see this a lot. So again, you have to go from the most recent sports season. So if you have an incoming freshman who played on a member school team in 8th grade, once they become, once they're enrolled and attending that 9th grade school, that athlete would have to count as one of the 6 permitted to participate on, say, a fall baseball team together from the same school. Now, if they there's a lot of middle schools and junior highs that may not have a school program. So if they did not play for a school team in 8th grade, then they would not count towards that 6-player limitation. So there's just a few questions that you'll have to ask the athletes once you're kind of determining how many people or how many student athletes from your school team can participate together on that fall baseball team. And then one more exception is that graduating seniors are not counted in that limitation. So we'll go with the sport of volleyball. So you'll get through this fall volleyball season, and say you have 2 seniors and 3 juniors that want to participate together on the same club volleyball team after this fall season has ended. Now you're thinking, okay, that's 5 players from the same school team. That wouldn't be permitted because in the sport of volleyball, they can only have a maximum of 3. Well, those 2 seniors do not count because their, eligibility in the sport has ended. So that's just an example. Now, if you have 1 senior and 4 juniors that want to participate, that would not be permitted either. Even though that 1 senior doesn't count, you can still only have 3 juniors. And then one last thing to note is that we do separate grades 7 through 8 from grades 9 through 12. So we'll stick with volleyball again. You could have, even if you guys are in the same school building, in the same school district, you could have 3 8th graders and 3 9th graders that participate together on the same non-interscholastic team outside of the season, because again, we do count those separately. Now, 7.5 speaks to coaching outside of the season. So OHSAA member coaches are permitted to coach on their own athletes, or not even their own athletes, on non-interscholastic teams. And the only time that they cannot coach them is during the no contact period. So the no contact period for almost all of our sports, with the exception of spring sports, is 28 days after the school season has ended. So again, we'll stick with volleyball. Say you make it through districts. Well, you lose in the district semifinal. So starting the next day, counting 28 days later, that's when the no contact period would take place. The spring sports, as well as the sport of basketball and ice hockey, their no contact period is August 1st to August 31st. And please note that basketball and ice hockey have both the 28 days after the season and the August no contact period. And individual sports do not have a no contact period. The no contact period is essentially, the intent of the rule is to give the athletes a little bit of a break. So it's just mainly no instruction or coaching. Now we get questions of, could we hold a sports banquet, or can they come in and turn their uniforms back in during that time? That's totally fine. It's no, you can talk to them on the phone. You can see them out in, at the grocery store or whatever it may be. It's just no coaching or instruction during these no contact periods. And one exception to that is if there is an opportunity for a coach to coach their athlete in an all-star contest, that would be permitted. And then the last part of the individual or General Sport Regulation 7 that I want to cover is individual skill instruction. So if you look on the screen, these are actually the same numbers that we just covered for the number of athletes that can participate together on a non-interscholastic team outside of the school season. So the individual skill instruction regulation, the kind of intent is just to allow school coaches to work with their student athletes outside of the school season, with the exception of the no contact period, in small groups, mainly just to be able to allow more time to practice together and that kind of thing. However, they are limited to the numbers listed on the screen. So we'll go back to baseball. So what this means is, outside of the school season, anyone on the baseball coaching staff can provide individual skill instruction to a maximum of 6 players at one time. So these must be individual skills being taught, and there can be no type of team play. But also, it's not limited to 6 at one time in the facility. It's just limited to 6 in one group. So as an example, we'll stick with baseball. Say there are 6 pitchers. There's one coach working with 6 pitchers on the pitching mound. And then there's another coach working with 6 outfielders out in the outfield. That's completely fine as long as those groups of 6 never combine. And additionally, the groups of 6 can rotate between the coaches, but again, they can never combine to where there's more than the number of team members listed on the screen for that sport in one group. And please note that this does include watching video and film. And then one last note, now Kristen and the compliance department, they're kind of the team to stick with the bylaws. However, the one bylaw that our group deals with a bit is bylaw 9, which is contest with out-of-state schools. So the OHSA does permit OHSA member schools to practice, scrimmage, and or compete outside of the state. So this includes both bordering states and non-bordering states. So participation and competition with schools in bordering states can be done an unlimited number of times throughout the season, and travel to and participation to non-bordering states, that can occur one time per season. And the travel to a non-bordering state form must be filled out and receive approval before that travel and participation can take place. So a few rules of general information with bylaw 9 is that all of the competition must be classified the same for both schools competing. So what I mean by that is if you schedule a scrimmage, the school you're competing against must count it as a scrimmage. If you're counting it as a contest, the school you're competing against must count it as a contest as well. And so those participation numbers, any travel to a bordering or non-bordering state must count in your regular season scrimmage and contest limitations. All of the games must be played by the NFHS rules in that state you are participating. So what I mean by that is, most states follow the NFHS playing rules pretty well, but one example I always give is the state of Michigan. They have given up their ability to have a seat on the NFHS Rules Committee by doing this, but in the sport of baseball in Michigan, they start all of their batters with one strike and one ball. So I think the intent is to potentially speed up the game process. So what that means is if we have Ohio schools playing baseball games in Michigan, they are able to follow that one count start at the start of each batter. However, if Michigan schools are playing in Ohio, Ohio clearly does not follow those playing rules, and so Michigan would have to follow the Ohio playing rules. And then all games must have licensed officials from that state. And then the Ohio administrative rules must still be followed. So again, I'll stick with baseball. In the sport of baseball, Ohio has a specific pitch count rule. So say a baseball team goes down to Florida to play over spring break. They still, even though they're playing games at Florida, they still must follow the Ohio pitch count rule. And again, you must fill out the travel to a non-boarding state form on the sport webpage to receive approval before doing so. And then one quick note is we do have a few non-interscholastic waivers during the sports season. So for the sports of golf, bowling, and tennis, we do permit, I believe in all three, it is 2 times per season. A athletic director can fill out a non-interscholastic waiver that is listed on all of the sport web pages to allow them to participate in a non-interscholastic event during the school season. So since out of those 3 sports, the sport I work with is bowling. So just as an example, during the school bowling season, up to 2 times per season, a student athlete could participate in 2 non-interscholastic events. But again, you do have to fill out those waivers and send it to the sport administrator. And then there was an asterisk back on the previous slide, if you noticed that. So I did mention that college ID camps are considered non-interscholastic and are not permitted during the school season. However, in the sports of soccer and field hockey, in soccer it's 1 time per season, and field hockey it's 2 times per season. A school administrator can fill out the college ID camp waiver for a student athlete to participate in those in a college ID camp during the school season. Kind of the reasoning for this is we started seeing, especially after COVID, a bit of a shift of the recruiting periods for the NCAA. So again, we didn't really want, if the college ID camps were changing that much, we didn't want to hinder student athletes from that opportunity. But again, those are the only two sports that is permitted for. And that was all I had. And I can turn it back over to Kristen unless there's any questions that were listed in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Em. So I'll jump in here. We do have a couple of questions that popped up. The first one's surrounding the no contact period. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not conditioning is permitted during that no contact period?
That's a great question. So it is not permitted by the school coaching staff. I mean, it does have to be overseen by a coach, but it could, again, I think it's good to just remember the intent of the rule is to give the student athletes a little bit of a break. So I think that type of conditioning could take place, but not by a member of that sport coaching staff.
Great. And then going back to the individual skill instruction, the limitations that are placed within GSR 7, are those separated by grade level as well? Or can you talk about how it differentiates between 7th and 8th grade programs versus high school programs? Can those folks intermingle, et cetera?
So I feel like that's kind of a bit of a gray area, a little bit, but when it comes to that individual skill number participating together. So I guess say the question was, could I have, we'll stick with baseball, where there's 6 to be allowed receiving the individual skill participation. So say you want 6 8th graders and 6 9th graders to participate in that individual skill session, that would not be permitted because ultimately it's just 6 in one group. So it doesn't necessarily matter the grade that they're in. There can only be a maximum of 6. So Kristen or Ronald, you might be better fit to answer kind of, if 7th and 8th graders can practice with 9th through 12th graders. I know typically it's a bit of a gray area because you want to avoid kind of that recruiting, that could be seen as recruiting, that type of thing. So Kristen, I didn't know if you had a better answer to that part of the question.
Sure. So there would be a prohibition on 7th and 8th graders practicing with high school students during the school season. So that absolutely would not be permitted. Outside of the school season, they could do training together, but would just encourage schools to keep in mind some of the discrepancies in the skill level, as well as the stature of the students, especially in sports. Where there can be big discrepancies that might impact the student athlete's safety.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Those are all the questions that we have. Then I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kristen and bid Emily farewell.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. I'm going to take just a few moments to get myself set up with our screen sharing, and then we will dive in here. I would love to be able to continue to see the questions as well. I don't know if I can arrange that, but. There we go. All right. So again, what we are going to be focusing on right now is student athlete eligibility. So whether or not they are allowed to participate in a contest based on their age, semesters, transfer, etc. So we'll dive right in. As a reminder that there's 10 different aspects of bylaw for student eligibility, and those are listed here. And a student must be eligible in all respects in order to be able to play on your sports team. So if you think, oh, I have a transfer student, they're allowed to at least play the first half of the season. But if they don't have the grades, they're not allowed to play during the first half of the season. So you have to make sure you're checking all the 10 different sections of student eligibility in order to determine if they can play. A way to help you do this is bylaw 361 talks about an eligibility certificate. So this is listed on our website at this link. If you go to ohsaa.org and just go to the eligibility dropdown, this is a form that we give to people as a tool. You are not required to use our form. And the good news is if you are a final form user, you are that program completes these on your behalf, and then it would just be your responsibility to check. And so what it does, you ask the student's name, what date they were born, when they entered your school, whether or not they're a transfer student, and all these different things that you can check beforehand, and then you can inform your coach that these students are eligible. Because unfortunately, too many times people assume that all the kids are allowed to play unless the athletic director tells them they're not allowed to. And it should almost be backwards, that no one is allowed to play until the athletic director verifies eligibility using either our eligibility certificate or the own local one that you created, making sure they're eligible and then informing your coaches that they can begin to play. These do not have to be submitted to the OHSAA office or to the tournament level. That used to be a regulation that was removed a few years ago. Your only obligation is to fill these out before each respective sports season for every single team and just keep them on file at your school. On occasion, we will request to see these to check different areas of student athlete eligibility for any given team. But again, you do not have to submit them to our office. Moving in then to section 2 of bylaw 4 is the age bylaw. So it's divided into 2 different sections, pretty simple at the high school level, that once a student turns 20 years old, they become ineligible for OHSAA athletic participation. So they could be eligible the entire year, their senior year if they're 19, but say they're a baseball player. They are 19 on the state semifinal day. They turn 20 on the state final day. They would be ineligible on that day. So there is an exception for this rule for a student, for a child with a disability who would otherwise not impact the outcome of a contest. A lot of times we get these for students either with autism or Down syndrome that will be continuing through school till the time they're 22 years old and just want to continue to be a member of the team. So again, that is more so a rule of compassion and not necessarily to allow a student with a great athletic prowess to continue playing into their after their 20th birthday. The 7th and 8th grade level regulations are a little more complicated, but not too bad. So if a student turns 15 before August 1st of the school year in question, they are ineligible to participate. So if you have an incoming 8th grader who turns 15 on July 30th, unfortunately, that student would be ineligible because they turned 15 before August 2nd. But if you have a student who turned 15 after August 1st, I think I said August 2nd there a moment ago. Apologies about that. If they turn 15 on August 5th, that student is eligible. So August 1st is the magic cutoff date to determine athletic eligibility under age for the 7th and 8th grade level. And just like at the high school, there are exceptions to this bylaw where is a rule of compassion if a student was either retained in grades K through 3, or if they are a student with a disability and they would not impact the outcome of a contest, we are allowed to grant those students eligibility even though they turn 15 prior to August 1st. Now, this last bullet point that I have here is very rarely used, but it is an option. So if you have an 8th grade student who turns 15 before August 1st, they do have the ability to play up at the high school level and that student be eligible. That is the only time that a 7th or 8th grade student is allowed to play with and on a high school team. Now, there is a caveat to that where if a student does utilize that option to play for their high school team as an 8th grader, that will count as one of their semesters of eligibility. So we'll go over that here in a moment, but just keep in mind that the semester that they start playing up, quote unquote starts their clock, and it counts as high school eligibility for them. So I'm going to go through this thing and then I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions. But related to the semesters, at the high school level, a student is only permitted to have 8 semesters of eligibility taken in order of attendance and regardless of whether or not they participate. And that last part is very important, regardless of whether or not they participate. So we're about out of our COVID era where we had students who unfortunately lost their spring season due to COVID, and some even their fall sports season, depending on whether or not your schools went back to having sports in the fall. But it does not matter if a student was hurt, they tore their ACL, maybe didn't play a given year. If they want to come back for a 5th year of high school, that would be their 9th and 10th semesters, and such a student would be ineligible regardless of whether or not they participated. And similar to the age bylaw, there is an exception to this rule, which will grant a semester of eligibility into the 9th and 10th semester for a student, very much so related to rules of compassion and whatnot. And if you have such a student who is entering your 9th and 10th semester, would encourage you to reach out to me there. But the general rule, again, 8 semesters taken in order of attendance, regardless of whether or not you play. And as you can imagine, at the 7th and 8th grade level, that is 4 semesters. So 2 years, they are able to participate. And the caveat, though, is if they start playing high school as an 8th grader because they are too old, it doesn't matter what they did in 7th and 8th grade, that starts their clock for their high school. Ronald, before I move on to the next section of section 3, any questions so far on the age or semester bylaws?
We do not have any as of right now.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much. Moving on to the more complicated section of bylaw 4.3, which is really related to where kids are allowed to play sports. So bylaw 4.3.1 is kind of the golden standard of education-based athletics. It basically says you play sports where you go to school. And you can see there is a whole variety of different reasons that we view the field, the mat, the court as an extension of the classroom, where if students are walking the hallways of that school during the day and then they go play sports for their school, that it is viewed as education-based athletics and all of these great things that come along with this. But there are 7 exceptions to that rule, that if a student does not attend your school, they might be able to play sports for you. So if you have a student who comes to you and says, I want to play sports for you, am I allowed to? If they are enrolled in attending your school, the answer is yes. They're allowed to play, assuming they're eligible in all other respects. If they don't attend your school, then you have to ask yourself, does a student meet the requirements of an exception to bylaw 4.3.1? Now, it would encourage you at your leisure, within your handbook, bylaw 4.3.1 outlines all of the different exceptions that are available. I'm not going to go over all of them in detail. You can think of a JVS or a career tech student. They get to play sports where their records are maintained. Those are the sort of other exceptions. But what I'm going to focus on here today is exception 6, and that is in accordance with state law. So state law has carved out participation opportunities for 4 different classifications of students. And you can see I have them highlighted in green here. So if a student is home educated, if they attend a non-public school that does not offer a sport, or if they attend a community or a STEM school that does not offer a sport, those kids most generally are allowed to play sports at their local public school. And I'm going to get into more details around that here in a moment. But you can see the classifications of students that are missing from that green highlight there are students who attend traditional public schools. And you can see this last bullet point I have here. In May of 2022 and May of 2023, our office put forward a referendum proposal that was approved by our board of directors to allow public school students who don't offer a sport that they want to play to potentially play that sport elsewhere. In May of 2022, you can see it failed by a narrow 12-13 vote margin. That, from what I can find, is the closest vote in OHSAA history. So what we did is to put in a few more safeguards we felt and put it back up for a membership vote. May 2023, unfortunately, it failed by a more significant margin. So as of right now, if its student attends a public school that does not offer a sport they want to play, those students are not allowed to go play sports elsewhere. It doesn't matter if they're open enrolled out, but they want to play for their local public school. There is simply no exception which will allow those students to play sports at a different OHSAA member school. Now, the classifications of students who are carved out within Ohio Revised Code, there are a couple different options for them. So for non-public school students, they can play sports where they go to school if the school offers it. And then they can also play, you can see the first thing here, at their local residential school, or if their non-public school is physically located in a different school district, they can petition to play the sport at that local public school as long as their residential superintendent and the public superintendent where the non-public school is physically located. So those are the agreements that would have to take place. An example here, if any of my Warsaw Riverview alumni are on here, I'll use my hometown as an example. If I was a non-public school student, say I attended Coshocton Christian, but I lived in Riverview Local School District, I could play sports at Coshocton City Schools because that's where Coshocton Christian is physically located, as long as the Riverview superintendent, my local residential superintendent, and the Coshocton superintendent agreed to allow that participation. But if either of the superintendents did not agree to allow that participation, those students at Coshocton Christian who live in Riverview would only be allowed to play sports at Riverview. So those are the options for non-public school students. Community and STEM school students, so think Ohio Virtual Academy, any sort of online Ohio community school, they are only allowed to play sports at one location, and that is at their local public school. If their local public school does not offer that sport, they are not permitted to play that sport anywhere else. And a key warning here, so kind of flashers for those of you taking notes. If a student comes to you and says, I live in your district, I go to an online school, can I play sports for you? You have to make sure you ask, what school do you attend? Because Ohio Virtual Academy is an online school, that's an Ohio community school. However, Liberty Online University, although it is an online school, it's based out of Virginia, and state law does not apply to schools in Virginia. So you have to make sure that the school that they are attending is an Ohio community school, and you can look that up on the Ohio Department of Education website just to make sure the school that they are attending is an Ohio community school. The last classification of students who state law covers are home educated students. And they have two options as well. So they can play sports at their local residential school, or if their local public school does not offer the sport that they want to play, they can petition a non-residential superintendent, and it does not have to be a neighboring district. It's any district who wants to play, who has the sport that they want to play, that they could petition to play that sport elsewhere. And as long as the receiving superintendent, I'll use that terminology, agrees to allow that home educated student to come over and play, that student would be allowed to do so. Now, that is fine at the 7th and 8th grade level if they go back and forth, because remember, if the public school where they live offers that sport, they must play that sport there. At the high school level, if for example, my public school offers volleyball and I want to play volleyball, but I also want to swim and they don't offer swimming, you can play volleyball at your local public school, petition somewhere else to do swimming and diving potentially. But at the high school level, each time you go back and forth, that invokes the transfer consequence for those students. So again, home educated students, if they are a single sport athlete wanting to play elsewhere, there really are no problems with that. But it's if they are a multi-sport athlete and the law forces them to go back and forth, the families in question may want to heavily consider whether or not they want to petition to play a different sport elsewhere, because there could be some transfer ramifications. The last thing I'll get into with respect to the enrollment and attendance bylaw and where kids are allowed to play is the assignment of non-enrolled students in a multi-high school district. So if I were here in the Columbus City School District, a home educated student does not get to pick and choose which Columbus City school they want to play sports for. There are business rules that have been approved by our board of directors, and they are listed on our website. This flow chart is a snapshot of where these kids are allowed to play. Most generally, they are allowed to play at the school located in their attendance zone or at the school closest to where they live if there are no attendance zones. So if you're not a multi-high school district, you don't need to worry about this. But if there are several high schools within your district or within your system, certainly reach out to me if you would have follow-up questions on those. So Ronald, before I move on to scholarship, are there any questions that came in for the enrollment and attendance bylaw?
We do not have any. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, moving on then to bylaw 4.4, which is the scholarship bylaw. There are a lot of things that we're going to cover here. So I guess strap in and we'll move forward. A student entering 7th grade, they are eligible regardless of past academic performance. So they get a clean slate starting in 7th grade, regardless of what they did in 6th grade. Now, your district is certainly permitted to establish your own local standards that might be harsher or stricter than that, but under our regulations, incoming 7th graders are always eligible. After that first grading period, 7th and 8th grade students have to pass a minimum of 4 classes during the immediately preceding grading period in order to be eligible for sports. And the good thing at the 7th and 8th grade level is math counts the same as gym, counts the same as weightlifting. So as long as they receive a passing grade in 4 classes at the 7th and 8th grade level, they would be eligible. Similar concept when you go into matriculate from grade 8 to grade 9. Because you were in 8th grade during the immediately preceding grading period, you still are held accountable to that 4-class standard your first grading period of your 9th grade year. Now, after that first grading period is when you transition to the high school standard. And the high school standard is that you have to pass a minimum of 5 1-credit courses during the immediately preceding grading period. And we'll talk about equivalencies and those things in a little bit more detail here on the next slide. But you can see the 5th slide here. Review is always of coursework completed during the immediately preceding grading period. So if your school is on quarters, you look at the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. If you are a school who is on semesters, you're only checking eligibility under our rules 1 time a year at the end of each semester. And that can be good and bad because students earn their eligibility for a whole semester or they lose their eligibility for a whole semester. I would say the vast majority of the schools around the state are on quarters. So that's when eligibility would change. And again, we'll talk about the timing of that here in a little bit. Summer school and other educational options done outside of the respective grading periods do not count towards athletic eligibility. So if you have a student who only passed 4 credits at the high school level during the last grading period, they did a class over the summer to improve their grade and get that changed, that is fine to change it for their grade card and their transcript, but such a class cannot be used to change their athletic eligibility. You need to think of athletic eligibility as a snapshot in time that you're checking their grades at the end of each grading period. And then the last bullet point here talks about when eligibility switches, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on that in the coming slides. So at 7th and 8th grade level, again, all you do is count 1, 2, 3, 4 passing classes. That's easy. The high school eligibility standard is where you might need to do a little bit of math. So I apologize for math on a Monday morning. But what you do to determine the equivalencies for a high school class is you take the credit value of the class, you multiply it by a factor, and then that determines the equivalency. So the factors you need to remember are year-long classes have a factor of 1 because you take it over the entire year. Semester classes have a factor of 2. Trimester classes have a factor of 3, And then semester classes, that should not say, that should be quarter classes. I apologize. Quarter classes have a factor of 4. And then the credit value, that's determined by each local school. So we cannot tell you what a class is worth. Your own grading policies and course offerings should tell you what the credit value would be. So let's go to an example here. So we have a student, again, the formula is at the very top here. We have a student who took these classes. So they took an English class, they got a B in it. It was 1 credit and they took it for 1 year. So if the factor is 1, so the formula for that class, 1 times 1 would be 1. Very similar for Spanish. They got an A in it, so that's passing. 1 times 1 is 1. History, got a C in it, so that's considered passing. 1 times 1 is 1. And then the same thing for algebra. So far, this student has passed an equivalent of 4 credits. Unfortunately, they didn't do so well in science and they failed that class. So even though the factor would be 1, anything times 0 is going to be 0. So the student would not receive any credit for this science class. This next class, physical education or gym, contrary to popular belief, you are allowed to use gym to help a student meet the OHSAA academic standard, as long as the class counts towards graduation. The key here is it will not count as a full credit. So you are always going to have to pair physical education with another class in order for it to have any impact on OHSAA athletic eligibility. I know some districts around the state just say it doesn't count. That way they make sure their students are scheduled for at least 5 full 1 credit courses, but you would be allowed to count it. So you can see here, physical education, it's a quarter credit. That's all the students getting for it. And they took it over a semester. So because they were taking it over a semester, the factor is 2. 0.25 times 2 would be 0.5. So they get 0.5 towards athletic eligibility. Similar with health, 0.25 times 2 is 0.5. So if you add all of those up, even though this student failed science, they would be eligible under our standards because they passed 5 credits or the equivalent during the immediately preceding grading period. If your district has a no pass, no pay policy, no play policy, that would be fine for you to hold that student ineligible for whatever period of time that you deem appropriate. But if you would want to allow them to regain their athletic eligibility, you could do that during the grading period because they're eligible under our standards. Moving forward to a College Credit Plus example. So the highlighted text down here in green is what you need to remember for CCP classes. So any College Credit Plus class, which is 3 or more semester hours of credit, receives 1 Carnegie unit. So if it's 3, 4, 5 semester hours, it's always worth a credit value of 1. Anything that is less than 3 credit hours, say a 2 credit hour class or a 2 semester hour class or a 1, that would be calculated by the fraction. So I'm not going to spend time doing that today. Reach out to me if you have a student who is only taking a 2-hour semester class. But the vast majority of CCP classes are going to be 3 credit hours or more, and meaning they are worth 1 credit. So the example we have here, the student took 1 normal high school class. It was history. They got an A in it. They took it for 1 year. So it was multiplied by 1. So they get 1 equivalency for that class. Their CCP English class, 3 semester hours, which remember is 1 credit. They took it over the course of a semester. So you would multiply it by 2. So 1 times 2 would be 2. So that CCP English class is actually worth 2 credits. Unfortunately, they failed their CCP calculus class, so that does not count for anything. And their CCP biology class, even though it was 5 semester hours, remember anything 3 hours or more is just 1 credit. So it would be 1 times 2 because it was a semester class. 1 times 2 would be 2. And again, this student, that high school class that they took saved them, because without it, they would have been ineligible because they only passed 4. But you add together their 2 CCP classes plus their high school class, and that makes them eligible. The last example we have here is an example of block scheduling. I'm not sure how many schools still use this, but always want to make sure that we provide an example. So calculus, it is 1 credit, but the students are only taking it over the course of a semester. So they actually get 2 credits towards athletic eligibility for that class. They're also taking French for 1 credit over the course of 1 semester. So that gives them 2. This student also took physical education for a 4th credit. They took it over a semester. So that gives them the equivalency of 0.5. Unfortunately, this student was underscheduled. They only passed 4.5 credits. Then that's where I talked about earlier. Whenever you use PE, you always need to pair it with another class to make sure it comes out to an equivalency of 5. Otherwise, the student would be ineligible like this student. Before I moved, we'll go over this part and then I'll open up for questions. So 1 or 2 years ago, our office pulled together a group of school administrators who were really having difficulties processing CCP grades because either the professors weren't giving it to the students, the grading periods were ending at different times. So a variety of different reasons allowed us to create this new exception which you are allowed to use for CCP students. Now, I will say at the end of the 1st and the 3rd grading periods, if you can collect their grades, I would advise you to do so because if you collect it during that snapshot, they've earned their eligibility for their whole next grading period and you don't have to worry about it anymore. If you are unable to collect their grades at the end of the 1st and the 3rd grading period, then that is when this exception might be able to come into play. So CCP students under this exception are presumed to be passing until it shows that they have either dropped the class or failed it, as long as they sign up for the class at the beginning of the semester. So you can see in the example I've provided here, the 1st grading period at this school ends on October 28th. The student signed up for the CCP class at the beginning of the semester, but it just didn't start until October 30th. So it starts 2 days after the grading period ended. The student only passed 3 credits at the end of the 1st grading period based on the classes that they were taking. But for the fact that that CCP class started a little bit late, that student otherwise would have been scheduled for 5 credits because they would have used their 3 high school classes plus the 2 credits they would have received for that CCP class. So that student, you could rule them eligible for the 2nd grading period because of the fact that they were signed up for the CCP class, but it just didn't start until after the end of the 1st grading period. The next example I will provide for you here, again, we'll use the same timeline. October 28th is when the grading period ended, but at the beginning of October, the student realized, oh crap, I'm underscheduled. I need to get enrolled in this CCP class. It doesn't start until October 30th, but as long as I sign up for it, I'll be okay. That student would be ineligible and would not be allowed to use this exception because they didn't sign up for it at the beginning of the grading period. So they only get the benefit of this exception to, I guess, shift when you would use that class if they sign up for it at the beginning of the semester in question. And then the last example I'll give here, again, same timeline. Your school's grading period ends October 28th. They signed up for the class at the beginning of the semester, so everything's okay there. They only passed 3 credits at the end of the 1st grading period. And the CCP class that they were signed up for started October 30th, so you ruled them eligible. However, on November 13th, they dropped the class. It was just too hard. They don't want to do it for whatever reason. Whenever you find out that the student dropped that CCP course, that student would become ineligible because of the fact that they did not earn their eligibility for the entire second grading period. So there is some, I guess, liability on the student that once, if you use this exception and if you drop the course or if you receive a failing grade in it, you do run the risk of losing your eligibility during a grading period in question. Ronald, any questions so far on the equivalencies or that exception 4? Okay, I'm going to assume not.
Sorry for the, I was clicking through 3 things. My apologies.
That's okay.
So we do have 2 questions.
Okay.
First one, can you talk about the differentiation, if there is one, between pass fail versus letter grades?
Excellent question. Thank you. So the bylaw only talks about passing grades. So a P for pass, an O for outstanding, an S for satisfactory. Even if they're not traditional letter grades, you are allowed to count them for the determination of athletic eligibility as long as 2 things. As long as the class counts towards the graduation credits that the student will obtain, and as long as they received credit during that received that grade during the grading period in question. So kind of the atypical pass fail classes, they are allowed to count, and you would use the exact same formula for determining the equivalencies. Just take the credit value they earn times the factor depending on how long they took the class, and that will give you the equivalency for that. Good question.
Thanks, Kristen. So on the second question, I'm going to read it verbatim. I don't know who it's from, but it asks, at the end of the high school academic quarter, are we still to assume our CCP students are passing until the end of their college quarter? And I know in the past we did have to request their in-progress grades as of the end of the high school academic quarter. Can you just provide a little more clarity on that situation?
Absolutely. Thank you. So that's a little bit related to this exception that I just discussed there. So if you can collect their grades, it's kind of the snapshot of grades at the end of the first and the third grading period, then they have earned their eligibility through that next grading period. And you don't have to check it again until the end of your school's grading period. However, if you are either unable to get their grades or just opt to use this exception and you don't collect their grades at the end of your grading period, then the student continues to be eligible until you either find out that they dropped the class or you find out that they failed the class. So if you don't collect their grades at the end of the first grading period and the college courses end December 15th, you find out that the student failed the CCP class, they would immediately become ineligible at that point in time. Whereas normally students don't become ineligible until the end of each grading period. So there's a little bit of a risk and reward that's done there if you utilize this exception, where as if you don't collect grades, they could become ineligible as soon as they drop the class or as soon as you find out that they receive a failing grade. Thanks for the question.
And that's all we have for now.
Okay, excellent. Again, really good questions, both of you there. I would encourage everyone, it's not gonna hurt anybody if you type a question. Ronald can either get you assisted or he'll do like he did just there for the betterment of the group, and we can answer it live for everybody. So what if you have a student who either fails classes and is going to become ineligible, or maybe they were ineligible and they earned their grades back? When do they get to start playing again? So this is outlined in bylaw 443, which addresses the restoration or removal of athletic eligibility. And you can see the language here says the eligibility or ineligibility of a student continues until the start of the 5th school day of the next grading period, at which time the last grading period grades take effect. So here's an example. We're in the 3rd grading period, transitioning to the 4th. The grading period ends on Tuesday, April 3rd. So again, what we're looking for, the start of the 5th school day of the next grading period. So in this example, the 4th grading period starts on Wednesday, April 4th. Holidays do not count. So we don't count the Thursday or Friday. holiday day number 2 is faculty in-service day. Day number 3 is a regular school day. Day number 4 is regular school day. So this eligibility would change on April 12th, which would be regular school day, number 5 there. Another example I'll give here, this past spring, we had a referendum vote that calamity days actually don't count as school days anymore. I actually need to update that last slide. So this is really where you want to pay attention on the start of the 5th school day when calamity days are not in effect. So on November 6th, we have our grading period that ends. The start of the next grading period is that next Monday. You count 5 days. So normally eligibility would change on November 13th. However, if we have calamity days on November 12th or 13th, that would push regular school days to November 16th and 17th. So in this situation, eligibility would change on November 17th, which would be the 5th school day of the next grading period. Again, because calamity days no longer count. We were receiving feedback that teachers, unions, they didn't want to work on calamity days. It was difficult to get the grades in before that 5th school day. So that's why calamity days were removed. The last example I'll give, this is to help students who have done the work that they needed to do to earn back their eligibility. So in those examples, that would benefit a student who was losing their eligibility, where they get to play a little bit longer because the change continued to get pushed back. But you don't want that to happen for a student who did the work they needed to do and is now earning back their eligibility. So it is exception 2 of bylaw 443 that a student could regain their eligibility after the 5th calendar day at the end of the grading period. This really helps dealing with winter break and spring break situations where students would otherwise be ineligible for a really long time. But you can see here the example I have provided, right around Christmas break, your grading period ends December 20th. The next calendar day, December 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th. So a student who completed the work they needed to do to earn back their eligibility could be eligible beginning on December 26th in this example, because it is after 5 calendar days have taken place. Now, the caveat with this, you can see there at the end, provided those grades can be obtained and verified by a school administrator. If you can't verify their grades by that time, you can't restore their athletic eligibility. But as long as you are able to verify those grades, you would be able to. And the good thing about this is this can be utilized on a case-by-case basis. So if you have students who are losing their eligibility, you can still use the start of the 5th school day of the next grading period, meaning those kids would be able to continue to play through the winter break in this example, and then maybe become ineligible on, say, January 6th. But if you have a student, again, who completed the work they needed to do to earn back their eligibility, they can become eligible after the 5th calendar day. So that is the transition of athletic eligibility there. I'm going to be moving into bylaw 46, which is the residency bylaw. I'm not spending a lot of time on this because it's a pretty basic rule that a student has to have a parent living in Ohio in order to be eligible. So if you have a student whose parents do not live in Ohio, they will either be ineligible or they would have to meet the requirements of one of the exceptions to this bylaw. So this is bylaw 462. I'll give you an example. The most common one we receive is when the parents live out of state, maybe they're in Florida, and they give custody to a primary relative, maybe grandma or grandpa who live up here in Ohio. Those students most likely will meet the requirements of exception 1 to bylaw 462, but they do need a ruling from our office before you would be allowed to play them in a game. So that is a little bit different than the transfer rule where you have some time to verify their eligibility. And that's why the eligibility certificate that I mentioned at the beginning is so important, because if they don't have a parent living in Ohio, they should not be allowed to play until they might get an approval from our office under this exception. Another one that is more relatively common for any private school that might be on the line here is that if a student attended the same system of education in grades 4 through 8, they are allowed to continue to play high school sports at an OHSAA member school, even if their parents don't live in Ohio. But those students have to get a ruling from our office in order to be eligible. So for example, if you have a family who lives in Kentucky, but their kids always attended St. Vincent de Paul in Cincinnati in grades 4 through 8, those students would be allowed to matriculate at a private school, a Catholic private school in the Cincinnati area, and be eligible even though their parents live in Kentucky. So those are probably the two most common exceptions that we receive, but there's one when families are living abroad, when parents get deported, lots of different options there. So I'll move on to any questions, I guess, Ronald, either on the transition of athletic eligibility or residency before I get into transfer.
None at this time.
Thank you. I didn't figure, but just wanted to check because this one might take a little bit of our time. So let me check what time it is, 11:15. Okay, so under the transfer bylaw, this only applies to students at the 9 through 12 level. So students at the 7th and 8th grade level can change schools however many times they want to, and they would not be subject to the requirements under this provision. The basic rule is that incoming 9th graders can establish eligibility at any member school that will accept them. Their local public school, their private school in their area, or they can enroll through open enrollment. So they can pick anywhere they want to. After they have established their eligibility there, any change to a different school will meet them, will be subject them to the transfer consequence. And that, in short, is sitting out the second half of the season and the OHSAA tournament and any sport that they played during the 12 months prior to their transfer. If you go to ohsaa.org on the eligibility dropdown, you can see this big red circle. There is a whole resource center dedicated solely to this transfer bylaw for follow-up questions on that. But if a student does not meet an exception, meaning they didn't move, they didn't have a change of custody, there's no paperwork needed for those students. They just start sitting out at the appropriate time, which I'll get here in a moment, and then they regain their eligibility after they've been enrolled in the school for 1 calendar year. So again, the transfer consequence is based on the number of maximum allowable regular season games that you play. So if a sport like track and field and cross country, you're allowed to schedule 16, but if you only schedule 10, transfer students are still allowed to play in the first 8, regardless of how many you end up playing. So again, that really helps those students receive the most amount of participation opportunity available to them. And similar in baseball and softball that have several rainouts, if you schedule 27 games, but you only end up playing 20, the students get to play in the first 14 games that you actually play, not what was necessarily on your original schedule. You can see on that transfer bylaw resource center that I referenced earlier, there is a chart there, and that chart is also in your handbook, which all of you should have received a little bit earlier this August. So transfer student, they have to start sitting out beginning with this game that's here in this last column, unless they meet the requirements of an exception. And some of the most common exceptions I've outlined here. Again, if they family moves from one school district into another, there are some limitations on you can only pick the public school where you move to, or if you're transferring to a private school, you have to move at least 15 miles. So those are all outlined within the language of the exception. And if you have a question, certainly reach out. But that's the most common one that we receive, probably processed over 1,000 of those in any given school year. Exception 2, which is a legal change of custody, when, for example, student lives with mom over in school district A, gives custody to dad who lives in school district B, so the student has to transfer to that school. That would be an example of an exception 2. And there are stricter requirements when custody is given to a non-parent. So if grandma gets custody or aunt and uncle gets custody, there's not a very high likelihood of an approval, unfortunately, because of some abuses that have happened in the past there. Exception 9, students receive a one-time transfer back to their local public school as long as their family has lived in that district for at least 1 year. So that one is more common. Another one I don't have down here, but I would consider it a sister exception to exception 9 is exception 5. This is only available for a private school. And if a student has attended a private school within the same system in grades 4 through 8, we'll say they attended a Christian school. They tried out their local public school in grade 9, wasn't a great fit for them, so they transferred back to the same system, a Christian school in grade 10. Those students would be allowed to utilize exception 5 to restore their full athletic eligibility. And all of these exceptions require an approval from our office, and there is paperwork that is required there. Exceptions 7 and 13 here, those are student bullying exceptions and adult criminal behavior exceptions. Documentation is really what I can say for those. It's pretty extensive with what we require in order to get an approval. And then the last one I'll mention is bylaw 475, a transfer from a poor performing school. We use the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce list that they created with respect to target schools, priority schools, etc. So if a student transfers from one of those schools on that list and we receive satisfaction that it is not a transfer done for athletic reasons, that we would be able to approve those students for full athletic eligibility. And then the last thing I'll mention here is if you have a student who transfers after they've already played in a regular season game at their former school, there is not a high likelihood that they will be able to play for you. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of those, but just understand that students who transfer mid-season might have a little different athletic eligibility for that sport than they would for other sports. I was going to say one other thing there and I can't recall. So I think we're going to wrap up that particular slide. And then the last thing I'll say here with respect to transfer students, generally the first person to find out if you have a transfer student is the coach because they weren't on the roster last year. They show up for tryouts. So make sure that you're communicating with your coaches that, hey, if there's any changes to your roster, you have to let me know so that I can determine that student's athletic eligibility. So that's all I have for transfer. Ronald, any questions that have come in so far?
Not yet.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm going to go through three more kind of different sections and then ask for some final follow-up questions there. So bylaw 4.8 is the international student bylaw. So if a student is not a U.S. citizen, they are ineligible for athletic competition unless they are living here with a parent. So if they're an international student who's here with one parent, at least one parent, you don't have to worry about this bylaw. But if they are an international student who is here without a parent, then you would need to request a ruling from our office before they would be allowed to play. The most common exception we receive under this rule is students here on a J1 visa. Consider them kind of exchange students. They're here for 2 semesters. There is a form on our website that you would fill out granting them eligibility. But sometimes we receive, I have an aunt who wants to get custody of the international student living abroad. Custody is not an exception to this particular bylaw. So make sure that you're monitoring students' birth certificates, where they were born. You should not be asking an individual if they are a U.S. citizen, but you are allowed to ask to see their birth certificate to figure out where they were born at. Bylaw 49 is the recruiting bylaw, and I literally have an hour and a half to 2 hour presentation that I do to schools on this particular bylaw. I'm just going to give you the very Cliff Notes version of this, and then would encourage you to contact me with follow-up questions or utilize the resource that I'll provide here at the end of this slide. So prospective student athletes are students who are enrolled in grades 7 through 12. So our recruiting regulations do not apply to any student below 7th grade. According to the bylaw, the term recruit means the use of any person, the use of influence by any person connected or not connected with the school, students included, to secure the enrollment of a prospective student athlete. This last part is key, for athletic purposes. So specifically for our private institutions, they have to recruit students to keep their doors open. But the recruitment cannot be for athletic purposes. And that's where the investigation potentially would need to come in on our part. If a student is recruited to a school, the student could be ruled ineligible, and there could be sanctions to the school in question. And if a coach formerly coached at a former school and got a job at a different school, if a student follows that coach, there could be some recruiting ramifications as well, where you would have to refute the presumption of recruiting. So the thing you just need to keep in the back of your mind is if you hire a coach and if one of their students comes with them, you need to contact our office before that student would be allowed to play in any games. On the eligibility dropdown on OHSAA.org, there is a recruiting bylaw resource center at the very bottom, and there is a very extensive PowerPoint that I would encourage you to either review at your leisure, provide a copy to your coaches and advise them. It has a lot of marketing guidelines on what schools are allowed to send to which student athletes. So I would encourage you to spend some time there, and again, contact me with any questions on that one. And the last part of bylaw 4 is section 10, which is the amateurism bylaw. So we want students who play education-based athletics to be amateurs in their sport. We don't want them to be professionals. So they cannot accept money, merchandise, or services of value based on the notoriety that they received. That would be a violation of the amateurism bylaw. 2.5 years ago, we put up a referendum vote to potentially allow some name, image, and likeness allowances, but the OHSAA member schools did not feel it was time for that, or did not like some of the provisions that were in there, and we have not received a strong push to revisit that. So as of right now, that is still the rule, where they can't receive social media kickbacks or anything like that based on their notoriety as an athlete. However, there is an awards bylaw where a student can receive an award, a prize valued up to $500, as long as that prize is not cash. So they can receive, if they're a golfer, they can receive a club, maybe a polo, a gift card, as long as it's not a Visa gift card, because that would be considered cash. So they are allowed to accept those awards based on their participation in actual contest. There are some regulations where if a student competes in an event where a cash prize is available, that they are allowed to do so as long as they sign a form with our office before the event, which agrees that they are not going to accept the cash prize if they were to be successful in earning it. So again, there are provisions where if they're participating in where there's a cash prize, or where there's travel, meals, or lodging reimbursements provided by the student, it's called the request for retention of amateurism status. So those are the forms that need to be completed before they participate in those events. So wrapping up the last things on student eligibility, it's a lot to process, and we understand that. What we would encourage you to, I guess, recognize and understand that we are a service organization. So we are here to help you. Please never hesitate to reach out with questions. And in that same sense, if there is an issue that you think might be a problem, would ask you to please reach out to our office, because we can only address situations that are brought to our attention. So if we're not in, you know, the thick of it in your communities, in your schools, we don't know what's happening unless we are informed of it. So please make sure that you're reaching out to us in those capacities. So I have a little bit more here, but before I move on, Ronald, any further questions on student eligibility issues?
No, not currently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. Last things that we'll go over here. Emily did mention bylaw 921 and 923. That is travel to a non-bordering state in kind of special contest. The National Federation of State High School Associations is called the NFHS. And think of the NFHS over the OHSAA as the OHSAA is over to our membership. So they are kind of the national governing body of all the different state associations, and they process the sanctioning of bigger events. So if you travel to an event, you can see here if it has an outside sponsor, if it has a non-bordering state where 5 or more states are involved, or 8 or more schools. All of these different events do require a sanction from the NFHS. So if you have a team who's participating in one of these larger events, please make sure you're paying attention to these bylaws and reach out if you have any questions on if it needs a sanction or not. Some of the referendum issues, there were only 6 of them that passed last spring, so no real major changes. What I will mention is there was a provision which allowed schools to request to play up to Division I, request an alternative divisional assignment. You can only request to play up to Division I, not any other division. And there were actually 11 schools who requested to play up in 14 sports that are outlined there. There were some requests in the same sport. That's why that's there. But we have our spring sport requests once our board of directors finalizes the spring sport divisions this Thursday at our board meeting. Then by September 13th, that will be the deadline to request advancement up to Division I for any of the spring sports. We already went over the fact that there are calamity days no longer count as school days, mid-season transfer modifications. Again, that's dealing when a student transfers, plays in a regular season contest at one school and transfers to a different school during the same season, that we would want to work with you on those, and that schools are now permitted to travel out of state for practice purposes only. So those were some of the highlights. I am going to skip these 2 slides and just get this last one. For any of you who are available, these are the lists for our regional update meetings. We did complete the Cambridge meeting last week, but all the remainder of them are still to be forthcoming, and we would highly encourage you to attend them if at all possible. Our executive director, Doug Ute, has a portion of our presentation. Myself and my team have a lot of what we just covered here with student eligibility. And then we also have an update from our legal team with some of the hot button issues that they're dealing with in the past several months. So that's all I have at this point in time. I appreciate very much your patience. I know that was a lot of information to throw at you. Ronald, any last questions before I turn it over to Alexis?
No, we don't have any other questions, but Kristen, if you want to throw out, where they could reach all of us, I think that might be helpful if anything pops up.
Yes, absolutely. So the who to contact on ohsaa.org, as I mentioned, is very important there. All of our email addresses are our first initial last name. So my email is kronai, RONAI, at ohsaa.org. And then the who to contact is really the best place to reach. I'm not going to bullet point each of our contacts information, but we look forward to working with you in the coming school year. Best of luck. Okay, at this point in time, we'll go ahead and then throw it to Alexis, who's going to talk about some technology stuff for you all. Alexis, you're muted.
Thank you. I was used to being muted, so thank you. As Kristen mentioned, I'm Alexis Holderman. I am manager of membership, and I'm going to be kind of going over the systems that we use, which right now is Final Forms and MyOHSAA. As an update for technology-wise, we are transitioning away from MyOHSAA. So we are going to be utilizing Final Forms as well as other technology entities to kind of carve out anything we need for MyOHSAA. So right now we are using Final Forms for staff management and school information. So I'm going to go over that first. And hang on while I get that ready. All right. So Final Forms, we have every single member school has a profile in Final Forms. Even if you are not a customer currently, we do offer a light free account. So if as a new AD or just transitioning to a different school and you do not have the right access, please let us or Final Forms know so you can get that proper access. But in terms of staff management, because at the end of this month, so this week and next week, we will be utilizing the communication platform within Final Forms. So it is vital to have all of your staff information there. And kind of where to go to that for sport specific. So for coaches and stuff like that, you'll want to go under Manage Sports. And first of all, you'll want obviously your staff to be entered into Final Forms in general, but for the way that we are using it, to make sure that you have them marked appropriately, you'll want to then go to, say, we're working with boys cross country at the 9 through 12 level. You can definitely differentiate between 7 through 8 if your school houses them within the same building. But for this specifically, we will go through 9 through 12. And you'll want to click on the coaches of that sport. And this is going to give all of the individuals that you have entered in as that sport specific coach. And the way that we can pull that information is based on their position title. So right now, we would need to know who the head coach is, and then any assistant, volunteer, or anything like that, because we will do most of our communication, if not all, just to the head coach. So really, that's the only one we need identified in here. So if, say, this was all blank and it just had the coaches listed, you will then want to go over to the coach information and select their position title here. And then once that updates, then we will know who to communicate to. And this is vital too. If you turned on, what we have communicated is a sync. So it's going to be syncing from Final Forms to MyOHSAA. That is an optional thing to turn on. And I'll show you here in a second how to do that if you would like, since again, we are still utilizing portions of MyOHSAA. So to kind of have a one-stop shop where you are only entering staff in one spot rather than two. That sync was created to do that. And that position title here is kind of vital for that information to be pushed. So not only for our communications in the future, but also for MyOHSAA purposes, this is where that comes into play. So like I said, to turn on the sync, once everything is entered, you'll want to go to Manage Schools. And then under the high school, you can edit. And then you won't see it on here because this is a demo, but there is at the bottom, there is a enable sync function. And it's just a check mark, and that's all you have to do. And then once you do it, it will push all of the head coaches, sport administrators, so your principals, athletic directors, over into MyOHSAA, as well as your school information. And so if you guys are a member as well in the 7th and 8th grade, then you can do that for the middle school as well. So kind of going back to then MyOHSAA, the second system that we are still using for this school year as well. That sync function will then push here in staff management and push everyone here. If the email address that you have in final form, so going back to the sports and the coaches, if the email address that you have for the coach matches what they have in MyOHSAA, then they'll be listed in red or green. The red just means they haven't completed some verification stuff, but they still have an account under that email address, or they're all good and they're listed here. Then that means they're good. They've had the right access and the email addresses match. If that is not the case, then they will have an invitation kind of section where that specific email has been invited to MyOHSAA. However, if they have an existing account and they go and accept it and then log in, it still won't identify them as the same, just because, again, that unique identifier is that email address. So it will override any changes eventually. So just make sure you're talking with your staff and everything is matching. Otherwise, it will all be listed here. However, if you did not turn on the sync, you can always add new staff here and enter any necessary information. And it will either, again, give that account that they may have somewhere if they've coached previously or officiated or something like that, then it will grant that account automatic access, or they will send an invitation to then create an account as well. So those are the two things. The reason we need some staff in here right now is mostly due to state rules meetings, which most of the fall is kind of concluding or in the middle of at the moment. But we know that for winter and spring and just so on and so forth, after the fall, we will be utilizing final forms for the state rules meeting. So it's just for the fall for right now. So hang tight with that fun process, which I will go over here in a second. For MyOHSAA in general, what we're still using it for is sports offer, tournament entry, emergency contact information, preseason parent meeting, and again, the fall rules meetings. So with the sports offered, you have, as an athletic director or principal, can determine the sports that your school is offering. So you'll want to let us know what those are. Because kind of like what Laura said in the beginning, this is where we determine what membership dues are owed, because you're check marking what sports your school is offering, and thus we are getting that number and then membership dues based on this right here. If at any point, say you thought you were going to offer it, but then something happened and just no one came out for it, or you aren't offering it anymore, you'll want to make that update here. You can uncheck, check whatever number, and then click save. And that updates the information for us. This also helps too. It's all tied to staff management as well. So you need to make sure the sport is offered here before you can even add a coach for that particular sport. So that's why everything is tied to here, as well as for tournament entry. If the sport is not checked here, then it's not going to show up in tournament entry. So once it's unchecked, then you're good. We get that notification you're not offering it anymore. The one caveat to make sure to do is to check mark cheer sideline. Because we need to know that even though it's not a non-recognized sport, we need to know for catastrophic insurance purposes. So if the sideline cheer is coming with a sport that is recognized here, then we need to know that for those purposes. And mind you, you can update these up until the tournament entry deadline, and I'll show you where that deadline is. But once that deadline is passed, you can no longer make any changes to the sports offered and or tournament entry. So if you are trying to say girls golf, because what Monday is the deadline for golf, after Monday, this will be grayed out and you won't be able to make that change. So you'll just need to notify our office of any of those changes after that deadline. So kind of tied into sports offered, like I said, is tournament entry. So here we need to know whether or not you guys are participating in a tournament for the OHSAA. So to do that, you'll want to click edit if you need to make any changes. Originally, in the previous year, whether it was you or a former administrator submitted their sports offered and tournament entry in April. And that was to let us know, kind of to get a head start on the fall mostly, but also for catastrophic insurance purposes. We just needed to know what school planned to have. However, we know changes can occur. So to be able to make any changes up until then, you would want to go to tournament entry, click the edit, and then you can make any changes here. Like I said, this is the tournament entry withdrawal deadline for each sport. So for golf, that is on Monday. So you have up until Monday to make any changes to golf. Tennis comes after, and so on and so forth. So if after that deadline something needs to change, please let us know, because unfortunately there is that $50 fine if needing to make a change after this deadline. And for any changes for, say, the individual sports, so under General Sport Regulation 17, there is what we constitute teams versus individuals for the individual sports. So like golf, tennis, cross country, gymnastics, those let us know who's coming in as a team. So for tennis, it's 4 or more is constituted as a team. So we need to know if you plan to bring a team or not. So just mark yes appropriately on the number of students you plan to bring to the tournament. Because that just helps our district athletic boards who do the first round of each tournament to know for finding a host site and just for planning purposes. And then two here, your division is also marked here. Obviously, in this case, this school is not real, so we don't have it. And then for spring, aside from lacrosse, those will come to you soon. Once you make the change, authorize and submit. All right, kind of going through emergency contact form. We need to know who to contact in case of an emergency. Since there are so many moving parts and not everyone has the ability to just pull these reports on who to contact, we have created this emergency contact form to submit for each and every sport so that our district athletic boards and then also just tournament managers are able to see who the point of contact is for anything that may go awry. So to do that, what's nice is if everything is entered into staff management, it's all going to come over. So if you're, say, for field hockey, you do plan to participate in the tournament. So you want to view the emergency contact, and it's already going to list the individuals that you have for your principal or your athletic director, and then anyone noted as the head coach. But here you are able to add or adjust any of that information if you need to, because say your assistant coach is also coming instead of your head coach, but you can leave your head coach there just in case for call purposes, but you would want to add in your assistant coach. So you can do that here. Now, mind you, that doesn't work where if you enter them here, they will then be on staff management. This is just a one-stop shop, but it does pull that in so you don't have to pull any of this information in. So once you make that submission, or sorry, once you enter all of this, or just make sure that it's verified and accurate, then you can submit it. And then that way we know who to contact, say for student just missed the bus or an injury occurred or something like that. We just need to have that information. Okay, so then going forward with state rules meeting, like I said, we are just using MyOSHA for the fall. So with that, you want to make sure that all of your coaches are viewing each sport rules meeting for the fall. So to kind of check that as an AD or principal, you can go to view state rules meetings, and this shows you all the attendance for every single sport. So for the fall sports, it's going to show either as sports not offered or meeting not attended, or that tournament entry is no. Because at a minimum, if you are participating in the tournament, it's required. Otherwise, it is not. Mind you, that doesn't mean you can't watch it. It's definitely recommended to still watch it since it gives some important information. But for our purposes, only one coach or one person from the school needs to view the meeting for that specific sport if participating in the tournament. So this attendance kind of helps show if you have gotten credit for it. Now, this just means that if, say, your coach viewed it, your field hockey coach has viewed the meeting, but it's still showing in red, you want to double check your staff management to make sure that that coach is actually listed. So that's part of where that staff management comes into play, as well as the final forms sync comes into play as well. So if they didn't view it, then you just know in red that, hey, coach, get this done. It needs to be done by the tournament entry withdrawal deadline. So you just want to make sure that you don't have any in red. And again, if there are any issues with any of this, feel free to reach out to us. We know it's a process, so we'll make sure there isn't a fine necessarily after a certain date if it's still in red. That fine is only to view the meeting, and the only, I guess, penalty is if you don't get it done by the deadline, then you could potentially be withdrawn from the state or from the tournament. So just make sure it's done before that deadline, and you should be all set. Last but not least, and then I'll get into some of the questions, is a preseason parent meeting. So the preseason parent meeting is a requirement from the OHSAA that to host one per season. If not, otherwise it is a $500 fine because that information is vital for both you and your parents to know. And it also helps save you guys as well in case anything happens, so that it can be covered for you guys. So, but for our purposes, we just need to know the date and time. So to do that, what we'll need is go to the preseason parent meeting here, and then you can add the meeting for each season, enter the date, and then time and the sports that it's covered. So every single sport needs to be covered. So that's also why we need to know the sports offered to make sure. And the date needs to be within 2 weeks of the start time of that sport. So for winter, it needs to be within that 2-week period that sport is going to start, or that season is going to start. So then check mark all of the sports it's covering. So if you are having 2 different meetings for different sports, then make sure to enter every single one. If it's all on one night, you can just enter for that entire time. But generally, we just need to know when those sports are given this information. If you do it on final forms, we know that there are those virtual options. Just enter the date that it was first available, and that will suffice for us because we know that it doesn't necessarily have a time for, like, say, August 1st. But just make sure it's entered because we just need to know that. Otherwise, you'll hear from me. That is pretty much what I have for my OHSAA and the systems. Ronald, are there any questions?
Thanks, Alexis. We don't have any questions that have come in, but if you don't mind, can you show where they can find the memos or not the memos, but the technology newsletter that we're putting together that's going out quarterly?
Yes. So we are issuing the technology newsletter that Ronald mentioned each quarter. So to find that right now, you can go to ohsa.org and then under school resources. And it's going to be here on the left-hand side. So the first one came out in July, so you can read that here, and that provides some updated information, kind of what we went through and then some today. And then we are continuously giving you guys updates and instructions regarding technology, not just from the newsletter, but just how to enter information into final form. So please be on the lookout for those because those are very helpful for instruction purposes. And kind of similarly, while I'm on this page, this too shows a preseason parent meeting. It provides a PowerPoint that we help put together that you guys can use if you would just want to know what kind of information to deliver to your parents, or an agenda if you want. Obviously, this is up to you if you want to use it, but it just helpful notes on what to cover in your guys' meetings. That is all I have. So, Kristen, if you want to take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alexis. That was really helpful information for them, and appreciate your efforts there. So before I kind of wrap it up, Ronald, just wanted to offer one last opportunity. Were there any questions that came in that we need to address before we get off here?
No, nothing else has come up.
Okay, excellent. Well, again, we really appreciate everybody taking the time. We know how busy you all are. Hope that you found this workshop helpful, and if nothing else, took a few nuggets away that you'll be able to reference throughout the course of the school year. So we wish you all the best of success and appreciate all that you do for the student athletes in your school. So best of luck this week, and we'll talk with you all in the near future. Have a great day.